court is in session. I think the jury just got back and they're getting settled in. Is there anything that we would need to take care of before they return into the courtroom?
I don't believe so. Well, I don't want to speak for the attorney.
We're going to want some time to talk about scheduling. It doesn't have to be right now.
We could do it now while they're getting settled in.
Okay.
They're not here. We don't have to be. So what is it that you needed help with?
We're trying to coordinate an opportunity to take Benjamin Crump's deposition, and the only time that's been offered to us was to begin at 6 p.m. Sunday, several days from now, and we object to that schedule. We're available all day tomorrow.
What is the scheduling issue with Mr. Blackwell?
We asked that Mr. Crump be available tomorrow because we knew that was a holiday, and we were told that neither he nor Mr. Blackwell, as I understand it, were available, and that they suggested that we begin at 6 p.m. on Sunday. That's not realistic or practical for us. While the deposition is relatively limited in scope, that doesn't necessarily mean it will be short because of potential objections, and there are indeed some new areas that may have come up as a result of Ms. Gentile's testimony.
What is it that you're asking for?
Well, the first thing I'm asking for is this. I would ask that the court recess on Friday so that we have that opportunity to take Mr. Crump's deposition. We also want to take the deposition of Steve Brenton with FDLE. We were provided with his report on June 4th, the one that's been the subject of many things, including the sanctions motion. We've had no opportunity since we started the Fry and other hearings and then jury selection, no opportunity to take his deposition and any follow-up there. So we need to do that. We need to take Mr. Crump's deposition. There are some other witnesses. If we had the opportunity, we would like to take their deposition.
Let me interrupt you for just a moment. What is the availability of Mr. Benton?
I believe he can be available almost any time, but I haven't checked with him recently. This is the first I've heard of this in terms of the need to do him right away. I know that in the past they had talked about wanting to take his deposition, but...
Because I know the state has said that they are planning on resting today, and this court intends to begin the defense on Friday, and that's what I had informed you yesterday. I have a jury that is sequestered. They're away from their home, from their families, and to have to take off for 4th of July, which everybody has requested and the court is obliging because it is a national holiday, to then also take off Friday and have them there Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday sequestered somewhere where they not occupied is just not reasonable. Mr. Crump has been available since we began this trial on June 10th until that was the jury selection process, until he was sequestered as a potential witness from the courtroom, but he was here for every day. I don't know what Mr. Blackwell's schedule is, but it has now been almost a month since we started jury selection or even our Fry hearing. I believe he was here on June 6th in the courtroom during those Fry hearings. The court recessed early on different days, so I don't know what Mr. Blackwell's schedule was, but to have this court continue keeping a jury sequestered without having court time because you didn't coordinate that deposition within a month's period of time, I find that very hard to do.
From a scheduling standpoint, we didn't know until late in the day on June 3rd that we would be allowed to take his deposition.
Well, that's a month ago. That's 30 days ago.
Your Honor, we've been somewhat tied up for the last month, beginning with June 6th, 7th, and 8th in the Fry hearing and the sanctions hearing that we haven't even finished yet. On June 9th, we met with our jury consultant and Mr. Zimmerman to prepare for jury selection, which started June 10th.
And it's my understanding that you had taken there were some depositions that were 5:30 last night. It's my understanding there's more depositions scheduled for 5:30 tonight. There's not been a request from this court to conclude court a little earlier on any day for the purposes of taking any other depositions. So I want to start, if the state rests today, the defense has Thursday, which is a holiday that you could utilize for whatever purposes you need to get ready, but it was always this court's intention that as soon as the state rests, that the defense begins their case. That's how it happens in every case I've ever had, and was my intention to continue to do that. And Friday would be the first business day after the holiday, so...
What we're asking for is a little more time, given the way this case has proceeded. As the court's aware, we were still litigating the admissibility of evidence after the jury selection began. We certainly couldn't have taken Mr. Crump's deposition during the trial day. The court doesn't expect either Mr. O'Mara or myself to leave the courtroom, I wouldn't think, to take his
You've left for other reasons, but I don't want to go there. I don't want to go there. And I don't want to get into a discussion back and forth about what times may have been available, but it's never been requested for this court to recess even a half hour earlier. I know during the Fry hearings, we recessed on a Saturday because your witness wasn't available, and the court had to continually ask when your witness would be available to finish it. I had to be the one who moved that forward. Neither side moved that forward because I wanted to get that matter finished because you wanted to know an answer about it before opening statements, and I accomplished that. And if there had been a request to recess even an hour earlier, I would have done that. But now I have a jury sequestered that are going to be off on Thursday, and you don't want court on Friday, that's Saturday, Sunday. I'm not doing that.
We asked the court
Okay, end of
to continue
discussion.
the case so that we could take Mr. Crump's deposition, so we could finish the Fry hearing just for a few days before we started jury selection. We have been, I think, asking at every opportunity for some additional time to finish these critically important aspects of the case. Likewise, I'm simply asking for some time now. I don't know if Mr. Crump's in the building today. The court could entertain ordering him to appear tomorrow.
We are taking up now time that I want to conclude this case. The state has indicated that that they would be finished with their case today. I would like to bring the jury in. You can continue to discuss this with me after the state has rested. Are we ready to bring the jury in?
Yes, Your Honor, and just for point of clarification, I know we've had some delays throughout, and I just want to, I'm still pushing for the end of the day.
I am too. That's why I would like to get started.
We may go into Friday morning, but it would be Friday morning at the latest.
Let's go. I'm prepared to go as long today as we need to get the state to rest their case so we can move on with the case.
No, just so that the court is aware.
Please have a seat. We will discuss this after we finish for the day. I would like to bring the jury in.
Yes,
You'll
sir.
have an opportunity. Thank you very much. Let's bring the jury in.
Jury is present, Your Honor.
Please be seated. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. While you're getting settled in, I'm going to ask my questions. If your answer is yes to any of the questions, please raise your hand. During the lunch recess, did any of you have any discussions amongst yourselves or with anybody else about the case? No hands are being raised. Did any of you read or listen to any radio, television, or newspaper reports about the case? No hands are being raised. Did any of you use any type of an electronic device to get on the internet to do independent research about the case, people, places, things, or terminology? No hands are being raised. And finally, did any of you read or create any emails, text messages, Twitters, tweets, blogs, or social networking pages about the case? No hands are being raised. Thank you very much. State, call your next witness.
I would call Anthony Gorgon.
Raise your right hand. Please solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you shall present will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Yes.
Thank you.
You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. You state your name for the record and spell your last name, please.
My name is Anthony Gorgon. That's spelled Gorgone.
What is your occupation, sir?
I'm a crime lab analyst at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement in the biology or DNA section.
How long have you been working for, I'm going to refer to it as FDLE, but the Florida Department of Law Enforcement?
I've been with FDLE for a little over 7 years. I started in March of 2006.
Could you briefly tell us about your education and training regarding your occupation, sir?
Yes, I received a Bachelor's of Science in Molecular and Microbiology. That was from the University of Central Florida, graduated in 2004. I was hired by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement as a forensic technologist. In that position, I screened items of evidence for the possible presence of bodily fluids that may contain DNA. I was promoted to crime lab analyst in July of 2007. I underwent a 13-month training program for that position. The first half of that training program was background readings, written and oral exams. The second part of that training was supervised casework. That would be actual casework under the supervision of a trained analyst. And that training, that 13 months culminated in a mock trial.
Okay. And have you kept up with the latest information regarding DNA, sir?
Yes, I regularly read articles published in scientific journals, as well as I'm required to attend at least 8 hours annually of outside training. That's usually conferences and workshops and classes dealing with the field.
Have you previously testified in court as an expert in DNA, and does that also include the significance of your finding regarding population stats?
Yes, I've testified 28 times in different counties in Central Florida prior to today, and almost every time that deals with statistics.
Your Honor, this time I tender the witness as an expert in DNA and statistics regarding DNA matters.
He may so testify.
No voir dire, Your Honor. Thank you.
Everybody by now has heard of DNA, but can you briefly tell the jury what DNA is?
Yes, DNA, it stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It's the genetic material that's passed down from generation to generation. Every person gets half of their DNA from their mother and half of their DNA from their father. And it's the genetic blueprint that makes each person unique. It codes for everything about you, everything from the pigment making up your eye color to the enzymes in your stomach breaking down your lunch right now.
And how is DNA used in a forensic setting?
Forensically, your DNA is found, a copy of your DNA is found in almost every cell in your body. Therefore, it can be left behind in bodily fluids that you leave behind, such as blood, semen, saliva, also sometimes hair and skin cells as well. And forensically, I could use those bodily fluids to develop what I call a DNA profile, which would be to analyze the DNA at certain locations on the DNA molecule, develop a DNA profile that can be used for identification purposes and comparison.
Are there other uses for this technology other than in a forensic or criminal setting?
Yes, several fields use the DNA, the same DNA testing that I use. It's used in medical and genetic research. It's used in organ and blood transplant donor recipient evaluations. It's used to test any abnormalities in the fetus during pregnancy when they do the amniocentesis. It's used in the identification of mass disaster victims, as well as the Innocence Project and paternity testing as well.
Is the DNA profiling and comparison method using STR that you're going to talk about, that your lab uses, being accepted in the scientific community as being reliable?
Yes, it is.
And is your lab, FDLE, been accredited and been through all the hoops in terms of their accreditations or being findings that they're proficient, et cetera?
Yes, we are an accredited laboratory.
Okay. I want to talk about the laboratory procedures for a few minutes if we could. Do you all have an established protocol or methods in which an item comes into your lab where you make sure that there's no contamination and that kind of stuff?
Yes, we have a quality assurance program that says that we have documentation of all the quality procedures. We have standard operating procedures that give specific instructions for every test that I do, so that every person working in the lab is on the same page and one person isn't doing one thing their way and another person doing another thing their way. So we have written protocols, and all of our quality assurance program is in writing.
And are there any controls within the testing themselves in terms of positive and negative controls to verify that what you're doing is accurate in terms of not getting any misidentification or contamination?
Yes, there are positive and negative controls at just about every step of the way. Before I even do the DNA testing, if I'm screening for the possible presence of blood, I need to test a positive control and a negative control of blood to make sure the chemicals I'm using are working. During the DNA testing, I have positive controls where I have a DNA profile. I need to get that expected DNA profile at the end of the process to know that not only that the chemicals and the instruments are working, but that my techniques are good as well. There are also negative controls at a few steps during the way, and those would be blank samples, and those samples need to remain blank the entire process.
In the lab, while you're analyzing evidence that's submitted in the lab, do you wear any kind of clothing attire to make sure that you don't cross-contaminate anything?
Yes, whenever I have an item of evidence open and I'm physically examining that item, I'm required to wear a lab coat, a mask, gloves, and sometimes a hairnet, depending on the item. When I'm actually working with the tubes and actually doing the DNA testing process, I'm also required to wear a lab coat and mask and work in chemical hoods with it's a sash that covers in front of my face.
And are all these procedures or quality control methods that you all utilize at FDLE, are they used by other labs in terms of being accredited?
Yes, any lab with a quality assurance program in place is going to have very similar protocols as far as quality control.
Tell us, if you could, briefly about proficiency testing in terms of testing yourself and also your lab to make sure that what you all are doing is working properly.
A proficiency test is a test given to me by an outside company. It's mailed in, and it's a set of samples that I have to work as if it were a regular case. And I perform that testing and send the results back to that company, and then they send a notice back saying, yes, you got the correct results, or no, you did not get the correct results. I'm required to take a proficiency test every 6 months. So I take one about May and about November of every year. And I've done that every year that I've been doing independent casework since August of 2008.
And is the entire lab also subject to proficiency testing, the DNA lab, or the lab, but the DNA department of the lab also?
Yes, every crime lab analyst and even the forensic technologists have to go through some kind of proficiency test twice a year.
Okay. Let's briefly talk about the exhibits themselves that would be tendered into your lab for analysis. In terms of making sure that you have the right exhibit in front of you when you're analyzing it, what kind of quality controls do you all have? Is there some numbering system or some cataloging of the items when they come in?
When an item is submitted for testing, we get items from outside agencies, such as local law enforcement agencies in the Central Florida area. They submit the items to our evidence intake section, the evidence intake section makes sure that that item is in a sealed condition, and they issue it an exhibit number for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, exhibit number, and put a barcode label and a case number on it. And then that item gets brought up to me once I'm assigned the case, and then I also examine that item to make sure it's in a sealed condition, and we have that barcode label, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement case number and exhibit number.
Do you also document when you analyze something in terms of putting your initials or some kind of markings to be able to say, like you will have to adhere in court, and say, yeah, I know I examined this item?
Yes, I mark the package before I open the package, I mark that package with my initials, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement case number, exhibit, and the date that I'm examining that item. And then the actual item itself, unless there's a reason why I can't mark that item, I will mark that item as well with that same information.
Okay. Let's now move on to the DNA testing you did in this specific case. I believe you used STR DNA testing, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Tell us, when we talk about STR DNA testing, what we mean by that, or what you mean by that, I should say.
STR testing is short tandem repeat testing, and I'm analyzing short segments on the DNA molecule that are highly repetitive segments. They don't actually code for any physical characteristic or any kind of molecule inside your body that's doing a job. They are just repetitive, non-coding regions of DNA, and I can take advantage of that fact, the fact that those repetitive sequences vary from individual to individual. So I can use these short segments of DNA to develop a profile for that individual.
And if you could, I'd like you to break down in terms of the STR process, are there, I think, 3 or 4 steps that you have to go through in order to first determine whether you have enough DNA and to actually develop it?
Yes. Well, the first step would obviously be analyzing the item of evidence for the possible bodily fluids, the blood, semen, saliva, as well as hair and skin cells. Once I have that stain that I want to perform DNA testing on, I take a small portion of that stain or swab and I put it in a tube and use heat and chemicals to perform what I call an extraction. That breaks open the cells in that stain, exposes the DNA molecule, and then hopefully I can isolate that molecule and wash away all of the debris and all the other chemicals in that sample. The next step would be called quantification, where I take that sample and see about how concentrated, about how much DNA was I able to recover from that stain. And I use that information for the next step, which is amplification. I'm basically making Xerox copies almost of the DNA molecule, but only at these 13 or 15 different regions that I'm interested in testing to develop the DNA profile. I make millions and millions of copies of the molecule at these specific regions so that I can analyze these regions. The last step is called electrophoresis, where I actually separate out the DNA molecules that I was able to amplify by size. I get a data readout, I interpret that, and create the DNA profile, which is essentially a set of numbers, and I can use those numbers for comparison.
And when you're going, I'm sorry, do you need a minute? No. When you're going through the extraction process on a stain or what you believe is a stain, might you be given the actual exhibit itself, like if I gave you this pen, or may there be a swab from that pen that you're first looking at?
It varies. Sometimes I get an actual item, like a pen, and say, who was possibly handling this pen? And then I have to take a swab and swab that pen for any skin cells that might be left behind. Sometimes I get a swab that was collected from an item. It was collected by the agency that submitted that, say Sanford Police Department or Orlando Police Department. They swabbed the pen themselves, put that swab in a box, and sent that box in to be tested. So then I just have the swab to work with. I take a cutting of that swab with a scalpel, put that in the tube, and perform my testing.
In terms of that second step, you talked about the quantification. Do you need a certain amount of DNA in order to even get a result? And what's the minimum you need?
Well, there's really no minimum. That step tells me about how much DNA I have in the sample, and I use that information for the amplification step. The amplification step, it's kind of like a recipe. Like you have a recipe that calls for 1 cup of sugar. ideally this recipe calls for about 1 nanogram or 1.5 nanograms of DNA. So I'd like to have that 1.5 or 1 nanogram of DNA to put in that tube in order for the reaction to work right, for me to get a DNA profile that I could use for some kind of comparison. But if I have less than that, I'm still going to go through with the rest of the steps to see, because sometimes I can get less information than the full, complete DNA profile, but it's still enough for me to make comparisons. And then there's plenty of times where I don't have enough DNA, and I don't get any results, or I get very little results. But I still go through with the step. There really is no minimum where I look and say, okay, I don't have enough DNA there, I need to stop. I'm going to go through with it regardless of how much DNA I have in that sample.
And educate us, if you could, nanogram, what is that? How much is that?
A nanogram, it's a very small amount. If you take an index card and cut that index card up into 1 million pieces, that would be about a nanogram, I believe. It's not a quantity that you can touch or feel.
Now, you mentioned also that in the process you're looking for markers or allele or loci, and you mentioned that the test you do is either going to give you 13 or 15 possible. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. In terms of STR, you have 13 or 15. Did I get that right in terms of markers?
Yes.
Okay. Do you always get 13 or 15?
No, like I said, sometimes based on the sample, the amount of DNA I have, or the condition of the DNA, sometimes I get less than the full amount of locations that I'm testing. That would be called a partial DNA profile. And if you get a partial DNA profile, are you still in certain cases able to make or give an opinion as to the results there? Yes, sometimes depending on the amount of information I have. There are times where I have so little information I can't make any comparisons to any individuals. But plenty of times with partial DNA profiles I can make some kind of comparison. So you get an item such as a pen, or you get a swab from the pen, you do all this process, and then do you end up comparing it to a known sample that you know somebody can testify has been taken from a certain individual? Yes. Ideally, in every case, I'm going to have question samples and known samples. A question sample would be, say, a swab from a pen. I'm trying to determine who was possibly holding this pen. A known DNA sample would be a sample collected directly from an individual. It's usually either a swab collected from the inside of their mouth, or some blood that's dried down onto a card to preserve it for future testing. I test those samples, those known samples, the same way as the question samples. However, they are processed at different times, and I develop a DNA profile for that individual, and I use that DNA profile from that individual for comparison to the question samples throughout the case. And when you're comparing that in terms of an item or DNA or swab from a pen versus a known standard of an individual, if you go through the markers and one doesn't match, are you able to eliminate a person? That depends on what my analysis of that sample is. If I test, say, a pen swab, and I determine that the DNA profile from that pen is from a single individual, then their entire DNA profile needs to match that entire DNA profile from the pen. So if there's one difference, then that person would be eliminated or excluded from being a possible source of the DNA on that pen. However, there are other times where I have mixtures of DNA, which I'm sure I'll be going into soon, where it's not a clear-cut, everything needs to match. It's a different comparison. That was going to be my next question. Tell us briefly about mixtures. And are we talking about major and minor, and then possibly at certain points more than one person in terms of 2, 3? Tell us a little bit about mixtures and how it factors in a forensic setting versus a sterile environment. Well, when I have a mixture of DNA, I have DNA from multiple people on a sample. So say I test that pen swab and I have an indication of 2 people or 3 people on the results from that swab. That would tell me that I have a mixture. What I need to do from there is try to separate out that mixture into the individual profiles that make up that mixture. And the way I can do that is sometimes one person contributes significantly more DNA to the sample than the other person or the rest of the people in that sample. And that DNA profile for that individual will stand out. And I call that a major DNA profile. If I'm able to resolve out a major DNA profile for that individual, There are times when I can determine a DNA profile for the lesser contributor, usually if the mixture is only of 2 people. But most of the time, I can't tell if a mixture is from 2 people, 3 people, 4 people. There's a lot of overlapping information in that data, and I usually can't determine any DNA profiles for the lesser contributors, but a lot of times I could pick out a major profile, at least from a mixture. In times where I cannot resolve that mixture into individual profiles, then I can still make a comparison to the known standards. I need to compare those known standards to the mixture as a whole to see if their DNA profile is represented in that mixture. And if it is, then they would be included as a possible contributor to that mixture. If they are not, if I feel there's enough absence of their DNA profile that they could no way have contributed to that mixture, then they would be excluded from that mixture. And then there are times where it's somewhere in between. I can't include them in the mixture and I can't exclude them based on what I'm seeing, so I'm not able to make any kind of determination for that person to that mixture.
Sometimes when you examine an exhibit, do you do a preliminary test to determine whether it's even blood?
Yes.
Tell us about that briefly, that testing, what that involves.
Depending on the case scenario, when I open an item and look at it, I could be looking for any of those bodily fluids that I discussed earlier. So if I'm looking for blood and I see a red-brown staining on the article of clothing or the swab or whatever it is, I'll take a rubbing of that stain, try to rub off a little of that material onto a small piece of filter paper, and I apply a series of 3 chemicals. And if I get a pink color change at the end of that series, that would give me an indication that that would be positive for the possible presence of blood.
Before we get into the heart of what you're here, I want to talk briefly about the significance of your findings. Assuming you get DNA results, I want to talk briefly about the population matters. And let me just ask you some questions regarding that if I could. When you examine the results, let's say you get an STR test, do you then determine the probability of a match in terms of what are the probabilities, is it? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, when I have a match, when I have a single source profile or a mixture and someone matches that DNA profile or they're included in that mixture, I need to put a relevance to that match. If I got a result at one location, at one of the 13 locations that I test, and it matches an individual, and what is the relevance of that one location matching an individual? There could be, maybe 4 other people in this room that match that location. So I need to put a statistical relevance to that match. So when I have 13 locations, I perform what's called a random match probability. Or when I have any amount of locations that I get, I perform a random match probability, and it's the possibility that you would pull a random person off the street and test their sample, and that they would match that unknown DNA profile that I got, whether it's at 1 location, 2 locations, or all 13 or 15 locations.
And is there a database that you have as a baseline in order to compare to determine, in terms of the percentage of the population, or how likely is that to occur?
Yes, the different results that I could get at these locations, they aren't evenly distributed in the population. Some results are more common than others. So I use population databases that were put together for the purpose of estimating about how rare or frequent these different results are in certain ethnic groups.
And are you familiar with the database that you all use?
Yes.
Okay. And has that been accepted in the scientific community being reliable in terms of, do you use the PopStats, I believe, or FBI, or what do you use?
I used 2 different databases during the course of working this case. For years, we used the FBI's population database. That is generally used within the scientific community. I did test a couple samples later on in this case where we had switched to a different database. We call that the Butler database because it was created by Dr. John Butler, and that's the one we currently use in our casework.
And has that been accepted in the scientific community as being reliable?
Yes.
Okay. And do you use the product rule in some way too in factoring that all in?
Yes.
Tell us briefly about the product rule.
The product rule, it's a simple statistical concept that says if you have a frequency for one event and a frequency for another independent event, and you want to see what's the frequency that both these events could occur at the same time, you can multiply the frequencies together. So for example, if you have a coin and you flip that coin, you have a 50% chance of heads, 50% chance of tails. Well, if you want to see what's the probability that I'm going to have two coins and I'm going to flip both and they'll both land on heads, you would multiply that 50% for one coin, 50% for the second coin, and you would get 25% that they would both land on heads. This applies to the random match probability, the statistics I use, because these 13 or 15 locations that I test are all inherited independently. So once I determine the frequency that you would find the results at one of these locations in the population, I can then multiply it with the other 12 or the other 14 locations using this product rule to get a frequency that you would find that entire DNA profile.
In terms of some of the results that you're going to talk to this jury about, why are some of the results in terms of the numbers more than the actual population of the Earth, which I believe is now 6.5 or maybe 7 billion? Why is it higher?
I think it's almost 7 billion now, the population of the Earth. It really doesn't have anything to do with the population of the Earth. It's more about the frequency at which I see these results. It's similar to, if you think about it, sometimes you see it posted somewhere that the frequency or the probability of winning the lottery is 1 in a million. Well, that has nothing to do with how many people play the lottery or how many people live in the area. It just has to do with what is the probability that I'm going to match all 6 or 7 of these numbers and get them all right, based on what's the chance that a 1 is going to draw out versus a 44. It's the same concept with the DNA profiles. It doesn't matter how many people are on the Earth or in the Central Florida area or anything. It's just the probability based on how rare or frequent these results show up in these ethnic groups. It's the probability that this entire profile will be seen if you test a random individual.
And I believe the three ethnic groups or race groups you have is African American, Caucasian, and then you have what else? Hispanics, I guess, Southeast Hispanics?
For a long time, when we used the FBI database, we calculated the frequency of profiles for Caucasian, African American, and Southeastern Hispanics populations. Those are the 3 most prevalent in the Central Florida area. When we switched to the new database, when we're using our new system where we're testing 15 locations instead of 13, we do statistics for Caucasian, African American, and Hispanic, as opposed to Southeastern Hispanic.
All right, well, then let's talk about specifically what you did in this case, now that we've got the basic stuff out of the way. I believe you did 3 reports in this case dated March 26, May the 9th, and July the 26th of 2012, and it's under FDLE number 2012, the last 4 digits are 1890. Your reports and your entire file has been copied and previously provided to defense counsel, so with the court's permission, may Mr. Gorgel refer to his report or notes at any time.
Any objections?
No.
Okay, thank you. Yes, you may do so.
It might be easy, Mr. Gorgone, if we start off with the standards. I believe you received 2 standards or 2 samples that you did some DNA analysis, and specifically a swab that was represented as coming from the defendant, George Zimmerman, and then also a DNA card or blood card taken by the medical examiner from the victim in this case, Trayvon Martin. Do you recall that, sir?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, all right. And what I want to do is first, with the court's permission, may I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
Sir, I'm showing you State Exhibit 186. Now I ask you if you recognize State Exhibit 186, sir.
I do.
How do you recognize State Exhibit 186?
The outer package has our FDLE barcode label with case number. It also has my initials and the date that I opened this package. The internal package also has my initials and the date that I opened and took a cutting from this sample.
Okay. And what do you understand State Exhibit 186 to be, sir?
This is a blood stain card from Trayvon Martin.
Okay. Let me show you State Exhibit 188, and I ask you if you recognize that, sir.
I do. The outer package has our FDLE barcode label, my initials, the date I opened the package. The internal packages with the swabs also have my initials and the date.
And what is that, sir?
This would be buccal swabs taken from George Zimmerman. That would be swabs taken from the inside of the mouth.
Okay. If I just show that to the jury, Your Honor. So all this writing that's on here in terms of, your initials would be on here, right here, right? I got it right. Where would your initials be on here?
Oh, right here.
Okay. And that would be true of all the exhibits, in other words, that you could verify that you actually did analysis on this?
Yes.
Okay. And it would have your FDLE number, and I think you said the yellow print card, or whatever you call this label, is also FDLE?
Yes, the yellow barcode label is from FDLE.
Now, those are what I think you referred to as standards, correct? Known standard from George Zimmerman and also from Trayvon Martin, is that correct?
Yes, those are known standards that were used for comparison to all the unknown samples in the case.
Okay. You do the process, you go through the extraction, quantification, et cetera, you get some results, I'm assuming, right?
Hopefully.
Okay. Did you get some in this case on both of those exhibits?
Yes.
Okay. Do you then prepare, and for the record, I'm going to show you State Exhibit 206, previously been shown to counsel, no objection. Well, I showed it to